Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me stop sharing. Good evening, everybody. My name is Russell Moore. I work at the USS Hornet Museum here in Alameda, California. We're very excited tonight to present a joint presentation with Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony of the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., and our own Bill Miklos of the USS Hornet Docent. We're going to talk about the Apollo space program, the politics and the technology of it. It's going to be an interesting combination presentation. At the end of the presentation, we're going to have time for question and answer. So anybody that wants to ask any questions, you can just type them into the chat section, and we will feed the questions as we go after the presentations are done. We hope you enjoy this tonight, and hopefully you got a chance to read the bios of both of our speakers before we started. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Muir-Harmony.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I wish I could join you in person, but maybe another time soon. So I'll set up my share screen. Just bear with me for a second. All right. So I'm going to begin and give you a sort of a brief introduction to some of the politics of the Apollo program, and then I'll hand it over to Bill, and he'll tell you about the technological side of the Apollo program, and then he'll hand it back to me, and I'll get back into some of the politics. So this is a fun format. I've never tried it before, but I'm really looking forward to this evening. So thanks for joining us. So to begin, I'll bring you back to the end of 1960, the beginning of 1961. And this is a moment when the future of America's space program was very uncertain. And so at the end of the Eisenhower administration, there had been a number of studies in 1960 looking into the future of the American space program, especially human spaceflight. And Project Mercury was already underway. So this was a program that would send one human into space on an orbital flight. No one had done it yet, but that was in the works. But the question still remained, what comes next? And there were studies that looked into what it would cost to send humans to the moon. And this information was presented to President Eisenhower just before he left office. And it was estimated that landing humans on the moon by the mid-1970s would cost between $26 and $38 billion at the time. Eisenhower's response was he wasn't going to hawk his jewels at the moon. So he thought it was, he compared it to Ferdinand and Isabella sending Columbus to the Americas, and he thought it just wasn't worth it. And so he didn't support that type of program. President Kennedy had his transition team look into similar questions about what should the future of the American space program be. And he got a similar response, which is it was going to be extremely expensive to do something like send humans to the moon. The lead on that task force, who would become his science advisor, Jerome Wiesner. So he thought that human spaceflight really could primarily be justified in terms of prestige, but you don't send humans into Earth orbit for science. And he discouraged it. He even encouraged Kennedy to reevaluate whether or not they should go ahead with the Mercury program at all. And so at this moment, it was really uncertain what the future of America's space program would be. And then things changed very, very rapidly. In the fall of 1961, so 60 years ago, we're celebrating the 60th anniversary period right now. A number of events happened that led to a changed approach for Kennedy. And most importantly, probably on April 12th, 1961, the Soviet Union launched the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. And it was a huge blow to US prestige. It not only was an impressive accomplishment when it comes to spaceflight, but it also suggested an incredible missile capability as well, heavy lift capability. And then in quick succession, there was the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. So this was a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba, and that was another blow to US prestige. So in response, President Kennedy asked his advisors, especially Lyndon Johnson, to find him a space program that promises dramatic results that we can win. And to Kennedy, it was really important that they were dramatic results. And I'll get into that in a second. He, even though initially thought maybe something like the desalination of water or something not related to space would promise dramatic results, but it quickly became clear that it had to be space exploration. And so he proposed this goal of sending humans to the moon, landing them safely, and returning them back to the Earth before the end of the decade in May of 1961, just a few weeks after the first successful American human spaceflight with Alan Shepard's flight on May 5th. And so he made this bold proposal when the United States had about 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. But I'll let you hear some of that speech, so Kennedy in his own words, and I ask you to listen very carefully to the words that he uses.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
So I hope you heard him mention that this issue of being impressive to mankind. Kennedy talks about how important space exploration is for the influence on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. And what he's talking about there is the Cold War, and the road that they should take is either liberal democracy like the United States or communism like the Soviet Union. And it's really important to understand the context of this moment, to understand why Kennedy chose lunar exploration as the goal, why the United States would invest billions and billions and billions of dollars in the 1960s to achieve this goal. And a lot of it comes from this moment in the 1940s. The World War II upended the global order and changed everything. So the United States and the Soviet Union became superpowers, and they became competing powers. And in addition, there was a wave of independent movements across the world with the end of colonialism, and there was the disintegration of European empire. So between 1945 and 1970, the number of nations increased nearly fourfold around the world. And in 1960 alone, the year before Kennedy made this speech, 17 African colonies became independent nations. And now this is really, really important for the Apollo moment. And the United States and the Soviet Union stepped in and they competed to guide this transformation around the world. Each superpower attempted to create a global coalition aligned with its respective ideologies. And while the United States sought to foster and spread liberal democracy, the Soviet Union advocated for communism. And so when Kennedy talks about freedom versus tyranny, he's talking about democratic versus communist society. And this idea of the impact of spaceflight on the minds of men everywhere also points to the fact that World War II, with the introduction of nuclear weapons, there was a greater emphasis put on other types of war, psychological warfare, soft power. So winning the hearts and minds became especially critical in this moment where you now have nuclear weapons and the risk of global annihilation. And so much more was invested into that type of foreign relations approach in this moment as well. And so for Kennedy, sending humans to the moon was part of this larger geopolitical approach, winning hearts and minds, building global alignment, steering the trajectory of newly formed nations. So in a second, Bill is going to speak about the technological history of the Apollo program and how we got to the moon. But I'll first say, as he's speaking, keep in mind that during this whole time, the United States initiated the largest public relations campaign in history focused on spaceflight, so that spaceflight would advance America's position in the world. So it would serve those political ends. And to just give you a sense of what that was like, here's an example of some of the types of exhibits they set up around the world. They had radio programs and television shows and film screenings and lectures, all sorts of extensive programming throughout the 1960s to promote the American space program. This also included astronaut tours. Here you can see Neil Armstrong touring through South America in the 1960s, promoting the American space program. So now I'll hand it over to Bill, and you'll see me again in a few minutes.
And then slideshow. Where's that? You can do it in the lower right corner. Right there. You got it. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you today to mix the presentation from Dr. Muir-Harmony and the perspective on the technology of the Apollo program here on the USS Hornet, which was the recovery ship for Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. Dr. Muir-Harmony played for you the speech of President Kennedy. And it's very interesting to note that at the point in time that he made that speech, what we had accomplished in space. Alan Shepard was launched into space using this small rocket compared to the size of the Saturn V. And he was launched on a ballistic mission. He was launched and his little capsule separated from the booster. He flew his capsule for a few moments, and then he fired the retro package, and then the capsule came down through the atmosphere. The heat shield protected the capsule from the heat of reentry. The parachutes opened, and then he landed safely in the Atlantic Ocean. His entire flight lasted 15 minutes and 22 seconds. We're going to be speaking to you longer than Alan Shepard's flight, but it was our first step. And if you go to the launch pad where he was launched, there is a plaque embedded in concrete that lists all of the uncertainties of spaceflight that we were facing back when Alan Shepard was launched into space. We didn't know if people could swallow normally in a weightless environment. We did not know if your eyeballs would maintain the same shape so you can focus on your instrument panel. We didn't know if your inner ears would function properly, or would you become nauseous in a weightless environment. And this list is, about 10 things that we did not know. So when John Kennedy gave us that challenge to go to the moon, how are we going to do this? Well, we are going to learn how to crawl. We were going to learn how to walk, and then we're going to learn how to run. We had 5 more missions, 1 more suborbital mission on the Redstone booster. And then we had the orbital missions using the Atlas booster here in the center. And the last Mercury astronaut was in orbit for 34 hours. And we learned that, yes, we can function in a weightless environment, and we could bring our astronauts back safely. After Project Mercury, the decision was made to do a lunar orbit rendezvous approach to the moon landing. So we had to learn how to rendezvous and dock spacecraft in orbit. So that led to Project Gemini, which is this particular vehicle right here. And the Gemini vehicle is a bit bigger, as you can see here, and it has 2 astronauts instead of 1. And we launched 10 of those missions, and we learned how to fly in space, how to change our orbits, how to change the inclination, how to rendezvous and dock 2 space vehicles, how to use that docked vehicle to propel the stack to higher orbits. And in those 10 missions, we learned everything that we needed to learn to fly our moon mission. In the meantime, when all this was going on, we were building the space hardware to go to Apollo, to go to the moon. That's the Apollo hardware, the launch facilities, the firing rooms, all of the launch pads.
We are testing out equipment for the Apollo mission, and that's going on in parallel with Mercury and Gemini. So let's take a look at the Apollo road to the moon landing. There were 5 development flights between October 68 and July of 69, and we were testing out the command module, which is this small command module that is the home for 3 astronauts, and also the lunar module, which was going to be the vehicle that takes the astronauts to the lunar surface. And this is only meant to be in orbit and service around the moon, but not return to Earth. So we were building and testing all this hardware, and we were using Saturn 1B and also Saturn V boosters. You can see we used the Saturn V booster, this immense machine, on Apollo 8, 9, 10, and 11. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the overall objectives was to evaluate all of this new hardware, confirm that we could do rendezvous and docking of the command module and the lunar module. We were to exercise lunar operations for the first time in human history, and then perform the landing and safe return to Earth. And that was accomplished in July of 69 with Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong. They returned safely to Earth on the 24th of July, 1969, but they still had to be in quarantine to ensure that their health was not harmed by their experience on the lunar surface. And the USS Hornet was designated the prime recovery ship, and I'll tell you more about that later on. So the spacecraft to achieve lunar orbit is a command and service module. And you can see it right there. The command module up in front is the only thing of this entire stack that returns to Earth. That little shiny cone in the front, and that has the 3 astronauts in it. The service module provides the propulsion, power, communication, and life support for the astronauts, and that is jettisoned slightly before re-entry, and then only the command module returns. The lunar module will take 2 astronauts to the lunar surface, and then will return them to lunar orbit to rendezvous and dock with the command module that is in orbit. And that is the lunar orbit rendezvous and docking. And you can see here the lunar module design has an ascent stage that will return to lunar orbit, and the descent stage does the actual landing on the lunar surface. And with this system, you don't want anything complicated in terms of hardware, because you're on the lunar surface and you use a simple pressurized blowdown system with pressurized propellant tanks to inject the fuel into the engines. So this is a pretty complicated design, and it worked beautifully. The Saturn V is also a masterful machine. You always think of the 5 F1 engines in the bottom, and actually there's 14 main engines in the Saturn V. The 5 F1s, there's 5 J2 engines in the second stage, 1 J2 in the third stage, and a number of engines in the Apollo stack that goes into the vicinity of the moon. There's 52 thrusters that provide attitude control for the various components. And then you have a number of solid rocket motors. In the first stage, you have 8 retro rockets, which fire to retard that first stage as it separates from the second stage. Then the second stage fires 8 ullage solid rocket motors to settle the propellants back into the tank so you can start the turbo pumps and start the engines going in the second stage. And that happens also on the third stage. In addition to these 89 engines, solid motors, and thrusters, there's a total of 188 additional pyrotechnic devices, explosive bolts, linear shape charges, all the things that have to deploy and separate to allow the mission to be successful. So the Saturn V is an incredibly complicated machine. 300 feet tall, it weighs 6,200,000 pounds at liftoff. And those first stage engines generate 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The first all-up flight was Apollo 4, completely successful, amazing. Unfortunately, the second flight of the Saturn V was Apollo 6. It was a near failure. But they implemented design changes to eliminate a pogo effect, which is an oscillation in the ascent of the vehicle. And also there was some stage 2 incorrect wiring, but that was all corrected. And a very courageous call was to go to the moon in Apollo 8 after we had the experience on Apollo 6. And Apollo 8 was entirely successful. They orbited the moon 10 times, and they safely returned to Earth. And then we had Apollo 9 and 10 flights to the moon, and they were also successful. So here's the liftoff of Apollo 11. 5 F1 engines have ignited. That's the nozzle. And now you see the exhaust from the turbo pump filling the nozzle. Then you see the very bright gases coming out, and that's the gases from the combustion chamber. 45,000 degrees in temperature. This is all water vapor that's frozen on the side of the propellant tanks because the liquid oxygen is minus 223 degrees Fahrenheit. There's also liquid hydrogen at minus 430 degrees Fahrenheit. Swing arms are pulled back. The vehicle continues its rise, and it's also pivoting away from the tower in case one of those swing arms did not exactly pull away completely. It took 12 seconds to clear the tower, and then stage 1 burnout, stage 2 burnout, and then we had the stage 3 provide the transfer ejection burnout. How do you? Bear with me 1 second.
Let's see. Let me get to the next slide.
Yeah. Okay, so there's the Saturn V ascending, and each engine burns 3 tons of propellant a second. So that's what it looks like to burn 15 tons a second. Then the third stage fires, and we're into translunar ejection, and then the command module extracts the lunar module from the third stage, course corrections, and then the command and service module engine fires to enter lunar orbit. The astronauts do a power descent initiation to land on the lunar surface, and then they spent about 22 hours on the lunar surface and brought back 47 pounds of lunar samples. Then the ascent stage fires, returns to lunar orbit. They do rendezvous and docking, and then the astronauts and the samples are returned to the command and service module, and then they jettison the lunar module ascent stage. They fire the service propulsion engine again to return to Earth, and then they enter the re-entry corridor. And then after they are confirmed to be entering the corridor, they separate the command and service modules, and then re-entry begins when the G forces indicate 0.05 Gs. The re-entry continues with 2 control periods, and then finally the deployment of the drogue chutes at 23,000 feet, main chutes at 10,000 feet. And then we have the USS Hornet coming into play. 4:20 on that morning, 2 E-1B tracer aircrafts are in the air, in addition to 4 Sea King helicopters. The tracers are a relay aircraft, and there's 1 air boss to control the airspace around the landing area to ensure the right people are going in at the right time. Swim 1 and Swim 2 secure the capsule, and then Recovery 1 contains the contamination specialist. Meanwhile, on the ship, Marine 1 is bringing President Nixon to the Hornet. At 5:28, the command module begins atmospheric reentry, and then splashdown is at 5:49. And at 5:58, the first diver is in the water, and he attaches a sea anchor to stabilize the capsule in the water. And then 2 more divers attach the flotation collar and a raft. And then the contamination diver enters the water at 6:30. The astronauts were in the raft, and 1 hour after splashdown, roughly, the astronauts are on board the USS Hornet. The contamination protocol, the decontamination diver deploys from Recovery 1. He puts on a biological isolation garment, which is a head-to-toe sealing of him from the outside world. He opened the hatch, he threw in 3 bigs for the 3 astronauts. They egress into the raft in their bigs, and then the diver closed the hatch and sprayed the command module with betadine. And then he swabbed himself and the crew down with sodium hypochlorite to kill any pathogens that may be on the astronauts' clothing. Then they're lifted to Recovery 1. And here they are going into the mobile quarantine trailer that's on board the Hornet. We have one of these on board the Hornet now. And this quarantine was motivated by concerns about unknown lunar pathogens being brought back from the moon. And here Nixon is meeting the Apollo 11 crew after about an hour after they entered the MQF. Nixon came down and they had a very, very nice conversation. And then he was off on his round the world tour that Dr. Muir-Harmony will tell you more about. So Apollo 11 had a successful completion. The Hornet steamed to Pearl Harbor and offloaded the MQF. The MQF was then airlifted to Johnson Space Center and moved into the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, where the astronauts could live in more comfortable quarters for the remainder of their 21-day quarantine. They were released from quarantine in good health on the 10th of August, '69. And I highlight good health because this is really what President Kennedy was asking for. Land men on the moon and bring them safely home. And with this release from quarantine, we could say they were safely brought home. So Apollo 11 and the efforts of 400,000 men and women working on the space program, all of that dedication, perseverance, and courage achieved the challenge set by President Kennedy in 1961. So that speech that Dr. Muir-Harmony told us about was satisfied 8 years later by the dedicated efforts of many people in 1969. So back over to you, Dr. Muir-Harmony. Stop sharing. Got it.
Thank you so much. All right. Let's see if this works again. Okay, wonderful. So back on the Hornet. Here's a shot that I love of that full view of the welcome home celebration. And that's where I'll pick up the story. President Nixon, when he was speaking to the astronauts on their return, he was so excited, and he told them that he had already received congratulatory letters from over 100 foreign governments, emperors, presidents, prime ministers, and kings. And he said that represents over 2 billion people on this earth, all of them who have had the opportunity through television to see what you have done. And he said that this is the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. And because as a result of what happened in this week, the world is bigger infinitely. And also, as I'm going to find out on this trip around the world, and as Secretary Rogers, this is the Secretary of State, will find as he covers the other countries in Asia, as a result of what you have done, the world has never been closer together before. And he said, we just thank you for that. I only hope that all of us in government, all of us in America, that as a result of what you have done, can do our job a little better. So what did President Nixon mean when he said to do our job a bit better? And that's the part I'm going to focus on right now. It has a lot to do with the relationship between the US and the world, and the important role that Apollo played in US foreign relations. And it's important to note that with the first lunar landing. It was followed by half the world's population. Estimates suggest between 500 and 600 billion people watched the first lunar landing live on television. And for many countries around the world, this was the first international live broadcast. It was the first truly global live broadcast in history, and that's an important part of this story as well. So from the Hornet, Nixon took off for Guam on his Operation Moonglow trip. And this was a diplomatic tour designed to use the popularity of the moon landing to advance Nixon's new foreign relations agenda. So his first stop was in Guam, and he gave a talk. He gave some remarks at the top of the MAR Officers Club. And he wasn't necessarily supposed to cover that much material, but he was so excited by meeting the astronauts that he surprised all of his advisors and ended up introducing what became known as the Nixon Doctrine that evening. And basically, he said that there would be no more Vietnams. The U.S. would not enter similar conflicts, that the U.S. would supply arms and assistance to threatened nations, but would expect that the nation supply their own manpower for military defense. And then throughout the rest of Nixon's diplomatic trip, which he took to the Philippines and Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Romania, and the United Kingdom, he drew on the Apollo program and on space-themed language, would use phrases like "for all mankind," which was quite popular at the time, to couch larger foreign relations issues, especially the United States' role in Vietnam. And here you can see an example of that. Here's a quote from some of his remarks from the Philippines. And by associating the popular lunar landing with these broader foreign relations themes, Apollo 11 served an important additional soft power function to the Nixon administration. On this trip, he also visited Vietnam. Very, very importantly on this trip, he visited Romania. You can see him in Romania here. And he arrived there on August 2nd, so not that many days after the first lunar landing. And it's important to break down this stop in particular because it was a major stop on his trip. So Nixon hoped to send a message to North Vietnam and China through the president of Romania, President Ceausescu, that the United States was ready to start improving relations. And Nixon said in his memoirs that Romania had good diplomatic relations with the North Vietnamese, and that he knew that anything he said to Ceausescu would be repeated to the North Vietnamese. He also wanted to start improving relations with China, and he knew that anything he said to Ceausescu would be communicated to China as well. So this became a really important moment in Nixon's trip. Shortly thereafter, the Nixon administration started planning the astronauts' diplomatic tour. So the Apollo 11 crew traveled the world. They did a global tour after their flight, after they came out of quarantine in good health. They traveled first around the United States, and then shortly after that, they traveled around the world. And tour planning took place at the highest levels of the Nixon administration. NASA and the State Department worked on the schedule, but then the White House quickly took over because of the political importance of the tour. And it was called Giant Step. Henry Kissinger, in particular, took a very hands-on role in tour planning. And this speaks a lot to the importance of this tour because there were many other pressing issues at the time. So there were weekly anti-Vietnam War protests, the Vietnam War itself, the Manson family murders happened around this time, the Woodstock Music Festival in upstate New York. But this was really capturing the attention of the administration at that moment. And to give you a sense of the expectations for what this type of diplomatic tour could achieve, here's some quotes. This is Illinois Representative Paul Finlay, and he wrote to the Secretary of State, and he stressed that across the world, the enormity of the accomplishment, which is the lunar landing, has created a reservoir of goodwill towards the American people. And he suggested that it was necessary to take advantage of this goodwill. And he stressed that it was important to do that in South America. And it had a greater potential than foreign aid dollars or other types of sort of approaches the United States could take. And here's an example of correspondence. I hope you can see it. I'll read this little excerpt. So this is, people from U.S. embassies around the world, foreign affairs officers wrote in and said, this is why the astronauts should visit this particular country. So they got a lot of feedback. And this memo talks about the importance of the moon landing in the USSR and Eastern Europe, and it was helped to overcome the sort of the isolation of these regimes, and the interest in the Apollo shots has proven too much for the regimes to contain. So there was so much enthusiasm, even in the Eastern Bloc. So this is a map of the astronauts tour. You can get a sense of all the locations that they visited. This was a whirlwind tour, 2 months long, roughly about 2 months long, and over 20 countries. And they would stay in each location for just a short amount of time, 2 days or so, sometimes even less, sometimes just a few hours. They wanted to be back in the United States in time for the next Apollo mission, which was Apollo 12. So it was a whirlwind tour. Right before they left, Nixon called Neil Armstrong up on the phone with instructions, and he counseled Armstrong to make it clear to the leaders of the countries that they visited that the tour symbolized the interests of the United States in maintaining space exploration as a project of peaceful benefits of all nations of the world. And he added that Armstrong should consider repeating the message from the earlier tour that the success of the Apollo 11 mission belongs to all the people on Earth, not just the people of the United States. And this is a message that Nixon stressed, and he thought the astronauts should stress it too, that the moon landing wasn't just an American accomplishment, it was an accomplishment of all humankind. And Nixon understood that could have a positive impact abroad as they traveled. So the first stop on their tour was Mexico City. You can see the astronauts here on a motorcade. So each stop followed a sort of similar approach where they'd land at the airport, there'd be a celebration, there'd be a motorcade parade through town. They would speak to large audiences. Sometimes they'd speak with scientists. They'd have meals with foreign dignitaries, that type of thing. So here they are in Mexico City. You can see Mike Collins all the way on the left, Buzz Aldrin in the middle there in the back, and then Neil Armstrong is there on the right. This is from their stop in Bogota, and then I also included a stamp from Venezuela, just to mention that in Venezuela, this was the moon landing was the first time that there was international live television coverage there. So it was an important event. And then the astronauts' visit was actually covered then live also throughout the region. So part of the impact of this diplomatic tour wasn't just for the people who got to see them in person. It was also then broadcast both sometimes within the country, like Colombia, and then in neighboring countries like Venezuela. And I'll point out that many countries around the world created stamps in celebration of the moon landing. There are endless examples of Apollo 11 themed stamps. After traveling through South America, the astronauts went to Europe. This is some images from their stop in Spain. And I bring this up because the Spanish magazine superimposed the astronauts within Spanish scenes, and a number of Spanish scenes in the magazine. And here, so there was a parody of a bullfight cartel, and then also the astronauts wearing the Spanish Matadors suits. And it was a gesture of the adoption of the Apollo 11 crew into local customs and local history, which was quite common on this tour. And the astronauts went to the Columbus Monument, laid a wreath there. So there was a lot of effort to connect local history with the lunar landing achievement. They went on a watercade. Here you can see them in Amsterdam, and then off to Brussels, all around Europe. Here they are in Germany. They visited the Berlin Wall. You can see them in Belgrade, and I'm just going to run through these quickly because for limited time. They did make one stop in Africa. There was initially it wasn't part of the plan, but Frank Borman, who was an astronaut advising Nixon, said it was essential to include a stop in Africa. Here's an example of a picture of them in India. This was one of the most popular stops. In Bombay alone, more than 2 million people welcomed them to the city. And it was a reception that was described as the biggest ever welcome in the city, and it surpassed the visit of the Pope. And it was a 2-day visit. They had this huge event in a stadium, and you can see it covered on the front page of the Times of India. And then this is the view of the astronauts from that lunar module you can see in the middle of the newspaper coverage, and they climbed up and down it. And many, many people were there in attendance. And this is the route of their motorcade, and this was passed out ahead of time. It was in the newspaper. It was handed out to people on the street to ensure that as many people as possible knew about the visit and could attend it if they wanted to. And here they are in Thailand. So they traveled throughout Asia. They visited Australia, Japan, and everywhere they went, foreign affairs officers reported back to the State Department saying that it was a really positive event. It had a great impact on the US's position in that country. And they were, in general, quite enthusiastic. So I'll just wrap up a bit here. Some of the commentary after that diplomatic tour. Henry Kissinger said that the visit of the astronauts abroad constitutes one of the effective policy vehicles available to us. And then the Undersecretary of State said that the visit of the Apollo 11 astronauts to many nations has helped greatly in extending and deepening the sense of personal involvement of the peoples of the world in our space program. So the last stop was Washington, D.C. They came to the White House, and there was a ceremony. You can see them here. It was a bit cold. It was November. And Nixon was so excited to welcome them there. And he said that it was the most successful goodwill trip in the history of the United States. And he said, certainly the first men ever to land on the moon have demonstrated that they are the best possible ambassadors America could have on this earth. And then he had a small dinner with them that night, just the astronauts and their wives. And over dinner and that evening, he asked them to report on their tour, to tell him about the conversations that they had with foreign leaders. And he thanked them for acting as his representatives. And then he made a comment, and he said that after their flight, he was able to get that meeting with the Romanian President Ceausescu. And he said that that meeting alone was worth everything that we paid for the Apollo program, everything that we spent on the space program. So this is a bit of an overstatement. And I think it's important to point out that as we heard from Bill earlier, Apollo was so much grander than the foreign relations objectives. And here's a slide that just gives you a sense of a few facts and figures about Apollo and what was achieved. In addition to the first lunar landing, there were 6 total landings on the moon, and 12 people walked on the lunar surface. They collected over 840 pounds of lunar samples, which we continue to study to this day. The cost of the program was immense. So by the mid-1960s, it was over 4% of the federal budget. At the time, about $25 billion. And then if you estimate today, the whole lunar effort is closer to something like $280 billion. But Nixon's comment about the cost of the Apollo program, how much the United States paid for Apollo, does point to a particular relationship between spaceflight and diplomacy in that period. So just to conclude, I want to bring up this story that Michael Collins told me. And he said that when the astronauts traveled the world on their diplomatic tour, that they were expecting people to say, congratulations, you went to the moon, or congratulations, the United States went to the moon. But what they said instead was that we did it. It was a sense of accomplishment for people around the world. In every single country they visited, they heard that same refrain, we did it. And there was a sense of that. It was something larger than just an accomplishment of the United States. So this is an image taken by the last mission to the moon, Apollo 17. And so as I was saying, that the Apollo program not only taught us about the formation of the moon and our solar system, not only about the development of new hardware and software and managerial techniques, it had tangible and immediate impact on US foreign relations. It created apolitical opportunities for the United States to have their diplomats meet with local leaders, or the astronauts on their diplomatic tour, or even President Nixon on his Operation Moonglow tour. The negative newspaper headlines covering the Vietnam War were replaced with the lunar landing, which was seen as a positive thing for the US's position in the world. But beyond these immediate impacts and scientific discoveries, Apollo revealed a very important lesson about being an effective global leader. And as Collins noted, that the message that resonated with people around the world was of participation, was of a global accomplishment. It wasn't just about US technical strength and greatness. It was this shared moment in human history. So as Kennedy had hoped, Apollo helped build this global community connected by their shared experience in the moon landing. Thank you so much for your attention. I think now we have some time to answer your questions. If you have any, please let us know.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Muir-Harmony. I have collected a few questions, so I'm just going to start reading them off one at a time, and you guys can decide between you which is most appropriate to answer. A Facebook user by the name of Ziggy U asked a question: how do you answer the question that the moon landings never happened? Everybody gets that, right?
For me, the funny thing is, I always get it from people who want to know what do I say when I get asked that. So I have yet to really encounter deniers. I will say that it would have been an extraordinary feat to have pulled off something fake that involved hundreds of thousands of people doing their jobs over the course of almost a decade, which is what occurred with Apollo. So that's one thing that you can say. Bill, how about you?
Well, since the moon landings, we've mapped the entire surface of the moon, and using lunar orbiters, we can focus on each landing site that the Apollo astronauts, and you can actually see the footprints on the moon. You can see the tracks of the rovers as they were driving around on the moon. Apollo 17 drove about 22 miles around the lunar surface, and you could actually see that track on the lunar surface using the imagery from the lunar orbiters. So I don't know how you can possibly fake that. That's the footprints on the moon, and here's photographs of it. And each landing site, you can actually see the evidence of the descent stage still sitting there, and you can see the footprints and the experiments and everything else on the lunar surface.
Even the flags.
And the flags.
Great answers. Facebook user Wahida Rashid, full disclosure, that's my wife. She wants to know what role is the Smithsonian playing to educate the young generation of the world about the history of the lunar landing by the United States. And I think you talked a little bit about it in your presentation, but this is not just the history of America, it's kind of the history of mankind.
I think it's an important part of that history to recognize that this is an important part of global history in the 20th century. It's one of the important moments of the 20th century for everyone on Earth. And if you meet people from other countries, many of them have stories about where they were. People name their kids after the crew in countries throughout the world. I mean, there are countless examples. So it is part of world history. And at the Smithsonian, we have a number of different ways to help introduce people to that history of all ages. So we have our artifacts on display. We have the mobile quarantine facility, which I hope you come visit, from Apollo 11, as well as a host of other artifacts like the Columbia Command Module. We have a new Apollo exhibit. Well, it's a destination moon exhibit. So it's about lunar exploration that'll open in just a few years. And then we also have other programming. So we did a television series, Apollo's Moonshot, and so other types of programming and things like that.
Bill, you want to add anything about the USS Hornet? It's kind of answering the same question. What are we doing?
Well, we are actually doing a series of videos that are on YouTube that discusses the entire space race from Sputnik all the way to Apollo 12. And there's going to be one more of those coming out discussing Soviet space hardware, but it's about 97 minutes of history captured in 5 parts that goes over the entire space race and how we accomplished the landings. And also we have a Step into History program where children come to the ship. We break them up into 5 groups and they go to different parts of the ship. And one of the places they go is the Apollo room. And guess who's there? And I give them 25 minutes of space race, sipping from a fire hydrant, and they leave knowing how we got to the moon. And in 5 years, we've done that 1,024 times, that presentation, over a 5-year period. So we're trying to get the word out there and planting these seeds that space and science is really, really a fun thing.
Great, thank you both. We have a question from Laura Fees, who is the exhibit curator here at the USS Hornet Museum. So her question is, in comparison to the anticipated political cache of the Apollo 11 Museum, I'm sure I pronounced it wrong, should it be considered just as extraordinary that the government put money towards additional Apollo missions that seemed more focused on scientific exploration and experimentation? Were they hoping for some similar political boosts, or is there evidence that they saw more value in the science?
Well, so there were additional diplomatic tours with later missions. The other Apollo missions were important when it came to American foreign relations interests, but there was also the recognition that it could advance science, and especially with the last 3 missions to the moon, there were much more extensive scientific programs. I will also say, though, there was an element of diplomacy in that as well. So the United States had a program to share lunar samples with countries around the world, and that was seen as also part of this larger initiative to build better relationships between the United States and the world. So lending out loaning lunar samples was one way to do that. And then also with the last mission, Apollo 17, as well as Apollo 11, they actually gave pieces of lunar samples to countries around the world. So there was a lot of other activities going on sort of related to that with the later missions as well.
Great, thank you. This is more of a comment than a question, but maybe this is a question for you, Bill. You know, the comment that our cell phones have more computer power than the computers they used on these early missions. Anything to say about that, to comment on, in some ways, how much of a miracle that is that was able to pull that off?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that the key to the success of this mission was the Apollo guidance computer in the command module. The same computer was in the lunar lander, but those ran on a clock of 2 megahertz. They had like 3,000 words of RAM and 37,000 words of ROM. And the software that was created for those computers was incredibly creative. You may know that when they were landing on the surface, they got a 1202 alarm right above the surface of the moon. And Buzz asked, give us a readout on 1202. Houston said, you're go for landing. And basically what happened, he had asked the computer to do something else. The computer said, I'm too busy. And the computer was actually programmed to shed lower priority tasks. So it said, I'm not doing it. I'm landing the machine. So it kept on going down and it just said 1202, I'm going down. And the incredible creativity that went into that software design is astounding, not to mention some of the engine technology and everything else, but it weighed 70 pounds each one, and they each used 55 watts. And they were incredible steps forward in computational power, and they made all of this work.
Pretty amazing. So I have a few questions that were handed to me before you guys started your presentation, so people were maybe speculating a little bit, but for example, was Russia able to use some of their space firsts kind of the same way that we were as far as public relations?
Yes, and actually, there are lots of great examples. So initially, the Soviet Union would send cosmonauts around the world. So Gagarin went on diplomatic tours, and the United States decided not to do that at first because that's what the Soviet Union was doing, and it was so important to differentiate the countries based on how they displayed their space programs, that the United States instead sent spacecraft abroad and focused more intensely on science and engineering and that type of programming. They changed over time, but the Soviet Union had an extensive program both within the Soviet Union and also on these world tours and exhibits and radio broadcasts and all sorts of things. So they had a similar type of campaign.
Great. Okay. So you mentioned that this is actually a question from me, I'll admit. You said this was the largest PR campaign in history. Was it the largest PR campaign in history to date, or is it still the largest?
I think it probably depends on how you judge it, but I haven't heard of anything that really can compete. I'm curious if there are examples. If anyone knows, please let me know. But it was on an extraordinary scale, and especially if you look at all the efforts undertaken throughout the 1960s. But for the first lunar landing alone, it was no expense was spared, and it was primarily the international public relations efforts were headed up by the U.S. Information Agency, which no longer exists, but at the time they were responsible for sharing America's story with the world. And so basically public relations and propaganda, and now that's under the responsibility of the State Department with those cultural affairs programs. But at the time, it was the largest undertaking the USIA had ever done, and they worked closely with the State Department and closely with other governments too, and then also local news sources. I couldn't get into it completely because of lack of time, but it was so extensive. It included things like inviting foreign journalists to the United States to tour NASA facilities and to meet with engineers so that they had firsthand experience and knowledge of the Apollo systems, and so that they could then go back to their respective countries and be space experts of the American space program in their respective countries. And it was just it was a really, really extensive prolonged engagement with the world throughout the 1960s to engage them in the American space program in various ways.
Okay. I have a question. Dave Klinger wants to know, how important was the Apollo program to the creation of Silicon Valley? That could be you, Bill, or both of you.
I think that it was very important because for the first time we recognized the importance of computerized equipment to assist us to do very, very complicated tasks. And once we established the utility of computers The uses of the computers just multiplied exponentially, forcing people to develop better chips, faster chips, higher speeds for the computers. I think it opened a window that showed people this is what computers can do. And all of a sudden, everybody recognized this is the next frontier to push technology forward. And I think it, in fact, was a very, very instrumental in getting Silicon Valley going.
And I'll add to that there's a huge amount of, you can't overestimate the amount of dollars going into R&D at that time because of Apollo. And it really eventually helped sort of seed the computer industry. So many people were able to become experts when it came to software engineering. And then after the Apollo program, we're then able to go take that expertise and apply it to other fields. And Apollo also marks this moment, this change when computers were getting larger and larger and larger. And because of the constraints of spaceflight, because everything needs to be as light as possible, so you use as little fuel as possible. So computers were forced to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's another important part of Apollo in the computer history story.
Well, I think we are here a few minutes after 7. So we said we were going to do about an hour. So I want to thank you both so much. Those were great presentations. I want to thank the audience for their questions. We had some really interesting questions. This video will be posted on our Facebook. So anybody that maybe logged in partway through, you can go watch the whole thing later. And so it will be available. I'm also going to put it on YouTube at some point. So people that you can tell your friends that don't use Facebook that they'll be able to watch this video as well. So Bill and Dr. Muir-Harmony, any last comments?
I think we were very fortunate to be living that time where we could experience what this was all about. It was such a tremendous technical achievement. And I think we're going to see things similar to it in the future. But this was such a gigantic effort involving 400,000 people focused on a goal, and to pull it off so successfully in 8 years is tremendous testimony to the power of the human will to accomplish great goals.
That's wonderful. I can't add anything to that. Bill said it perfectly. So I'll just say thank you so much for inviting me to join you this evening. And I look forward to visiting in person someday soon.
Oh, that would be great. Let us know if you come by for sure.
Yes, and thank you everyone for joining us. And let's look forward to the next space adventure.
All right, we are logging off.